Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, what's a bleeding heart libertarian? And that's a self-post that Spiritual Theme 3455 made. And yeah, personally, I think a lot of bleeding heart libertarians, they're more just progressives in all but name. That's a lot of, I think, a lot of so-called libertarians are really progressives, I think, but also, a lot of them are conservatives as well. I think only probably 20 to 25% at most of people use libertarian label are actually libertarian, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump calls for deporting U.S. citizens. We also have a lot of bad people that have been here for a long time. Many of them were born in our country. I think we ought to get them the hell out of here too, if you want to know the truth. So maybe that'll be the next job, posted by Ragnarok KXG, and that's a cross post from the Public Freakout subreddit. And yeah, I think this is just more Trump just kind of, jerking himself off, trying to rile everyone up. That's pretty much the only two things he knows how to do, is jerk himself off and rile everyone up. And yeah, I don't know if they'll actually go through with it, but if they do decide to go through with it, ultimately the government can deport anyone for whatever reason it wants to, and oftentimes people will have no recourse since the government has a monopoly on legal use of force, and they control the court system as well. So that's my thoughts there. Then we have, Powell confirms that the Fed would have cut by now were it not for tariffs, from CNBC.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I personally do think the Fed should have cut by now, but if the Fed doesn't want to cut because it's like tariffs is the reason, that's on them. I personally think the Fed probably shouldn't exist in the first place, and I think that's pretty much the de facto libertarian position. Then we have, begrudgingly, I must shout out 1940s Germany for realizing concentration camp merch would have been a bridge too far, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Brand New Sentence subreddit, and that's a tweet from Noah Garfinkel, who pretty much said the same thing, and then he was quote tweeting Betty Johnson, "Hey guys, I have just been handed official Alligator Alcatraz merch. I repeat, this prison has merch. Things are going insanely well." And yeah, personally, I don't think prisons should have merch, but if they want to have merch, I think they should be able to. I personally probably wouldn't buy any because that would be kind of licking the boot of the state. I don't really care for the concept of the prison that much. I don't think the state should be taking away people's individual autonomy, even if they have done some really bad and fucked up shit. But ultimately, people will justify it. They justify it. If they want to have merch that all the MAGA tards will buy up, I think they should be able to. But I personally wouldn't buy it because I'm sure they would have had Patriot Act merch back in 2001 as well. And look how that turned out. Then we have, Republican senator tells House not to vote on bill she just voted for, from Newsweek.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross post from the No Shit Sherlock subreddit. And yeah, it just goes to show you that people really don't have any principles. They'll just vote. A lot of people will just vote for whatever the party line says, even if they'll then turn around and say the opposite. It's like when in 2016, the former governor of Minnesota, Tim Pawlenty, called Trump unhinged and unfit, and then went on to vote for him anyway. It just goes to show you, people will fall in line, and they might say, "Oh, I'm not falling in line," but they'll just fall in line with whatever the party says. And I don't think that's very libertarian. The libertarian position is values and principles over partisan politics, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have, how can we fix the U.S. healthcare system with libertarian ideas, from Cellular Savant, was by Cellular Savant. They said, if we eliminate all the regulations and procedures associated with the pharmaceutical industry, it will definitely be helpful in reducing healthcare costs. However, rare diseases are often not profitable for pharmaceutical companies to do to the inherent small market. If we eliminate the programs that encourage rare disease research, then rare diseases will never be studied. These medications will also remain unaffordable. These are the numerous medical treatments that are currently unaffordable because they're not in the formularies for health insurance companies. The insurance companies also employ physicians to review certain claims. This directly contributes to the physician physician shortage at hospitals. I am struggling to see how we can ensure a majority of Americans get adequate health care about 1 to 2 authoritarian ordinances. This is why I propose, in addition to removing all the regulations and red tape. 1. All employees are required to pay for full health insurance for all employees making the 30th percentile salary per year in the state they reside. 2. Full health insurance is required to cover all medical interventions prescribed by a licensed provider. The system eliminates the inefficiency of insurance companies denying claims of people. Medicine is only prescribed if it is necessary, otherwise it is malpractice. This also helps with the physician shortage. If companies decrease wages to pay for health insurance, this is ineffective because it would lower the 30% salary. People in the bottom 30% are going to be covered by these parents' insurance or spouse insurance most likely. And yeah, I guess that... So, okay, I think the libertarian position is, you gotta keep the state out of it. Medical, it's interesting, a lot of progressives, they say, oh, I can't believe they justified slavery for so long, but then they also say, where's my free health care? And that's pretty much just slavery as well. Ultimately, the problem with medicine is just it's naturally going to be expensive, and healthcare as well. So I think, the libertarian position is, if people want the state to pay for their healthcare, and the taxpayers want a voluntary fund, state-funded healthcare, I think they should be able to. But I think we need free market options as well. So ultimately, I think people will justify what they justify in regards to like they do with everything else. But I do think you need to have people have the ability to choose what options they want in regards to healthcare, just like they should have the ability to choose what options they want in regard to everything else. Then we have Paramount agrees to pay $16 million to sell Trump's CBS 60 Minutes lawsuit from LATimes.com, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, I personally do think Paramount did, in 60 Minutes, did represent Kamala Harris's arguments when they aired the clip of her out of context. But with that being said, I do think they should. Freedom of speech does include misrepresentation and misinformation, and that's even true when big media does it. It's not something I personally care for. But yeah, I do think Trump does have a point when he asks for money, because it is kind of they're misrepresenting her argument. They misrepresenting Kamala Harris's argument. But I think the libertarian position is free speech. And that includes speech that might be misinformation or misrepresentation. And yeah, I personally don't really care for it. If I could definitely see, I don't really care for CBS, Paramount, and all that. If it were up to me, they'd be irrelevant and shut down. But the libertarian position is it's all freedom of speech. Even if you are a mega corporation. So I personally don't really care for Paramount. I think what they did was wrong. I don't feel any sympathy for them, and I do think I don't really care that they're throwing $60 million at Trump. But ultimately, you shouldn't need the courts involved in matters of speech. And even if it is a misrepresentation or misinformation, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, should cities run their own supermarkets, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, an article from The Economist doesn't think so. Alongside more typical left-wing fare, like rent controls and free buses, Zoran Mandani, the Democrat nominee for New York City mayor and a socialist, pitched a more novel idea, a public option for groceries in the form of a state-run rival that would undercut existing supermarkets. This is a curious proposal. Grocery stores have among the lowest margins of any business in America. They generally make 1% to 2% in profit after tax. More consequentially, these stores would also not pay rent or property taxes, denying New York's government the revenue of those plots will otherwise have earned among the amount to a chunky subsidy fueled by New Yorkers' taxes. At best, then these stores might sell groceries estimated more cheaply than conventional grocers, largely due to backdoor taxpayer funding. Worse, private supermarkets could get run out of business. Boxing them out would erode choice and stymie future grocery store innovations. Rather than a cheap and hyper-efficient city-owned grocery, a more plausible outcome is one where management eats up all the savings made from not needing to pay rent or return for a profit. Does anyone really believe a public option for groceries is a good idea? And yeah, I personally would say that if taxpayers want to fund public grocery stores, that they should be able to. But that being said, I do think the libertarian option is free market first and foremost. And yeah, if as I said, if they want to fund it, I personally wouldn't care for it. It's like if my neighbor wants to put his house on fire, I personally wouldn't care for that. I would say, but it's your property, do what you want with it. That's how I kind of feel about this whole New York election. It's like New York is just voting to drop like a nuke on themselves, and I personally don't care for that. But it's their city. If they want to vote to burn it down or drop a nuke on it, it's not my say. It's not as to what they vote or not. And yeah, I really don't care for these state-run supermarkets. I think they're just they're just a step before bread lines. But ultimately, if the city votes for it, that's what happens. It's just like, I don't care for Donald Trump either, but the country voted for him, and yeah, it just goes to show you, democracy is tyranny of the majority, where whoever gets the majority of the vote or gets to pretty much do whatever they want, and that's why I would say democracy is inherently unlibertarian, because libertarians are all about individualism, and democracy is inherently collectivism, and in pretty much every instance these days when it regards to government, it's forced collectivism. You even if you don't vote, you still have to abide by whoever is in positions of state authority. And that's my thoughts there. Then we have ICE tracking app skyrockets in popularity after Trump team freaks out, from newrepublic.com, posted by Baton13, and that's a cross post from the Behind the Bastards subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for any tracking apps, even if it's for feds. But ultimately, if you want to justify whatever you want to justify, I personally don't really care for ICE. So if you want to justify making an ICE tracking app, I personally don't really care for it. The government probably already has tons of tracking apps on civilians, and people don't, and no one bats an eye. But when the civilians make a tracking app for the government, everyone loses their minds. So it just goes to show you, it's pirates and emperors. The state can do pretty much whatever it wants, and no one cares. But if the civilians do the same thing, it's suddenly the worst thing ever. So I personally don't really care for it. I would just try and avoid ICE, but without getting the app. But if you want to get the app, I think people should be able to use whatever resources they want to justify using it at any given moment. So that's my thoughts there. Then we have Stop Calling Alligator Alcatraz Like It's a Fucking Theme Park, posted by Mundane Image 13. That's a post from Facebook, from the Occupy Democrats on Facebook. And then they added, the cruelty is the point and this administration's excelling in it. And yeah, personally, I think Alcatraz isn't really a theme park. It was a hard labor prison. But of course, progressive Redditors, they think it kind of sounds like a theme park, so that's pretty much the same thing for them. If it were up to them, they'd probably be calling it Alligator Auschwitz. That's what the .com on this post says, Alligator Auschwitz. But you could argue that kind of sounds like a theme park as well. But yeah, if you want to, I think Alligator Alcatraz might be the official name, but they call it whatever you want to. I think the libertarian perspective in regards to naming is, people can name things whatever they want, but if you want to call them something else, just by calling whatever you want to. Then we have Everyone is Welcome sign. Classroom sign violates new Idaho law, State's Attorney General says, from EastBayTimes.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, if they think that violates the law and wants to remove it, that's fine. But ultimately, I think that the problem is we have public schools in the first place, because ultimately any statement in a public school could be seen as an endorsement of a certain ideology, and I think that the state needs to be kept out of all ideological things when it comes to, and it needs to remain ideologically neutral at best, I would say. So I personally think the libertarian position is get rid of all the schools and have children learn for themselves, rather than have someone who's just going to try and push their ideology onto them, like we do have a public school currently. So that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Kilmore Abrego Garcia says he was beaten and subjected to psychological torture in El Salvador jail, from APnews.com, posted by LegioX. And yeah, I personally think this guy kind of seems like he's a crisis actor, because it seems like it's kind of too good to be true for the Dems. Oh, we sent an innocent man to the El Salvadorian prison. But yeah, ultimately, if they think if he wants to say whatever he wants to say, that's fine. But I'm definitely taking his story with a grain of salt, because it seems like something he seems like a guy that the media really wants to push at us, even if they send tons of other people down there as well, and they don't care, because they're usually just thugs and rapists. But this guy, he might have been innocent, so they can't just stop talking about him, and I don't really care for it. Then we have using alligators as a security feature is a lie, posted by Mundane Image 13. And they said the MAGA claiming that alligators are defense of alligator Alcatraz, the nickname for the proposed detention site in the Everglades, is pure dystopian bravado and dark propaganda, not actual security logic. Here's why it's nonsense. Alligators aren't guard dogs. They're wild animals not trained to patrol the perimeter or follow commands. Most gators avoid humans. They usually flee unless threatened or conditioned to expect food. The claim isn't based on any real security strategy. It's a scare tactic rooted in psychological warfare meant to dehumanize, not protect anyone. It's completely unpredictable and unreliable. You can't control wildlife like fence or patrol, relying on alligators' security is absurd. Worst of all, this approach undermines any legal or ethical foundation. It relies on cruelty and fear, not order or justice. It violates international human rights standards. Designing a detention system that includes threats from nature, whether intentionally or passively, is considered cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment under international law. Any serious detention facility is supposed to be prioritized due process, humane treatment, and oversight, leaning on wildlife and as a deterrent, strips away given even the illusion of legality or justice, revealing the site's true purpose, punishment for fear. It even puts staff in nearby communities at risk. Wild predators don't discriminate. Using them as a deterrent turns the entire area into a zone of hazard. So where does this kind of rhetoric come from? It echoes the brutal logic of the Soviet gulags, forced labor camps, where the environment itself became part of the prison. Built in remote frozen regions like Siberia or the Arctic, gulags weaponized extreme cold, isolation, and wilderness to crush any hope of escape. Prisoners who fled often died of exposure, starvation, or exhaustion before even reaching safety. The idea wasn't just to imprison, it was to break people down by using the natural world as a barrier, threat, and a weapon. Framing the Everglades alligators' security is cut from the same cloth. This isn't about law and order, it's cruelty masquerading as deterrence, and history's already shown us exactly where the road leads. And I kind of would agree with that, ultimately, but the thing is with the state, they can justify throwing you wherever they want to, instead of monopoly and legal force. I personally don't really care if they want to throw you in the middle of the wild in a prison out there where it's pretty much impossible to escape from, like the Soviet gulags, but ultimately they have the monopoly and use of force to do that if they want to, but so yeah, I personally don't really care for this whole alligator Alcatraz stuff. But ultimately, the state, if they want to build a prison in the middle of the wilderness and throw people there, sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That because the state, they can justify doing whatever they want to because they are in positions of authority, and and that's how they can, and when they're in positions of authority, they can justify using whatever force they want against you, even if you disagree with it. And that's pretty much all governance, and that's why I think all governance is inherently tyrannical and fascistic, because the state is inherently the one controlling the force, and if you ever fight back, that's illegal. But when they fight when they attack you, that's the law, and that just goes to show you that the law is inherently biased to those who control it. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. And I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.